when people rob banks, we just asked those people, the robbers themselves, how much they stole, and we trusted that number. Well, that's what most countries have been doing with greenhouse gas emissions. They just ask the polluters and go, okay, sounds good, I'll write that down. It explains a lot, doesn't it? Well, we have got to basically stop the polluter, everything that polluter says goes system in order to properly implement the polluter pays principle. And, you know, the countries that are doing what I just described are just the ones that are actually reporting their emissions. There are 71 countries that have not reported anything since the Paris Agreement. And as of December 2023, there were no country reports for 2022. So talk about timely data. And, former Vice President of the USA, Al Gore, thought, what if we could instead create an inventory that looks at greenhouse gas emissions throughout the world in a way that is transparent and independent, so that no greenwashing could get away with being unwatched anymore, and nobody could just claim what the emissions are without proving it. And so data scientists and climate scientists came together to create the Climate Trace Coalition, by which we are now estimating emissions for 352 million assets. And by that, we mean everything from oil and gas fields, landfills, forests, airports, mines, and even things like rice fields. So everything is on there, and we'll also make it free. It's free for everyone to use, and it's accessible for everyone with a good internet connection and ideally a laptop. And through that, we're able to see in a consistent way throughout the world where and how much is being emitted, so that we can influence the management of those specific emission sources. And I am part of OceanMind, which is one of the co-founders of the Climate Trace Coalition. And before I tell you a little bit about, we are responsible for calculating the maritime emissions for Climate Trace. But before I tell you a bit about how we do that, I will tell you a bit about OceanMind and who we are. We are a nonprofit organization based here in the UK, and we use machine learning technology to assimilate these different sources of data. And once we aggregate all of these, our systems create prioritized alerts for analysts to go through. And then we come up with actionable insights for governments and other users to then provide recommendations on what changes and what actions are needed. And if this looks like it's, we are very fisheries focused. We fight for the elimination of illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing and against unsustainable fishing practices. And if you think that that is not connected to the climate work, think again, because ecosystem-based fisheries management is climate action, and ocean conservation is a key part of the climate puzzle always. But back to how we do things on Climate Trace. Again, we have machine learning techniques to look at how much every ship in the world above 500 gross tons is emitting per nautical mile. So how we do that is our technology looks at the ship's automatic identification system, which is with the transmitter of the ship's position and calculates the time that the ship spends traveling and in port. We then work that into the speed of the ship, because speed is very correlated with emissions, so usually the lower the speed, the lower the emissions. We then also look at the use of auxiliary engines, because very often ships, when they're in port, they still use other engines. So their emissions keep going, even though their activity-based emissions are zero because they're standing still. So we calculate all of these things, and we come up with the emissions for about almost 50,000 ships around the world per ship. So that is very detailed information. And through this model that we've got, we've applied it to our data sets, and we've come up with really interesting things that we've seen. And I'm going to talk to you today about cruise shipping emissions and Arctic shipping. So we all know that in the past few years, it's been quite tumultuous, with COVID and all. And so for cruise shipping emissions, obviously we understand that they came to a screeching halt in March 2020 with all of the lockdowns and the travel, no travel go in a lot of countries. And so we can see that in the graph. You can see that behind me, the big dip in March 2020. But what is not so obvious is that, as you can see in the graph, the emissions actually start to bounce back after August 2021. And they bounce back and then some. And they're now sitting at about 6% higher than pre-pandemic levels. So we didn't learn our lesson, right? We always thought, yeah, we learned our lesson. No, we did not. And what is growing these emissions is the growth in demand for cruise tourism, which is particularly worrying because cruise liners emit more than any other type of ship. And one cruise ship emits as much daily particulate matter as 1 million cars. And it's not so much just about how much they emit, but also where they emit. Because, as I mentioned before, most ships keep their engines running when they're in port. And so the cruise ship emissions concentrate around port areas, and that disproportionately affects local coastal communities that are already being affected by other climate effects. So, and also, did you know that cruise ship per passenger mile taking a cruise emits double the amount of CO2 as taking a long-haul flight? So that's something to consider when you and your loved ones make holiday plans. Don't take cruises, please. Moving on to the Arctic. As we know, the Arctic is a critical part of the Earth's climate, and unfortunately, it has been warming at an unprecedented and exponential rate. And everything, in fact, that had been predicted in terms of timelines and intensity for Arctic warming and ice melting turned out to be too optimistic. And what is happening now in terms of sea ice and snow loss means that the Arctic is now acting as a sort of climate magnifying lens, where it's heating at least double, if not 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. And unfortunately, what this does is it creates also a vicious cycle in terms of shipping emissions, because the more the ice melts, the more shipping routes through the Arctic become viable and actually cut journey time. So companies can say, I'm cutting journey times, and guess what? I'm cutting emissions. But that means that those emissions are happening in the Arctic, which is kind of the worst place where they could happen. And because of that, you have more global warming, which means you have more ice melting and more routes open up, and again and again. So here on the map, you can see these routes plotted out, and it's not very clear, but there's also beneath the kind of the shipping activity in the Arctic. And so you've got 3 main routes. One is the Northwest Passage, like the Stan Rogers song, for those who know it. Oh, for just one time, I would take the Northwest Passage. No, Stan, don't take the Northwest Passage. And then the less culturally referenced Northern Sea Route. And there's also a route that passes all the way through the Arctic, which is the transpolar route. And luckily, this one is not commercially viable yet because it's only for heavy icebreakers. And we have to hope that this doesn't become the case, that it becomes viable, because that would mean that we really screwed things up. But hopefully, it's not all bad, because there's actually a group of companies that have taken a strong stance through the Arctic Shipping Corporate Pledge, and they voluntarily avoid sending their products through the Arctic. And they represent about 42% of the world's liner fleet, so that's significant. And let's hope that number grows. So if you are a business, please join the Arctic Corporate Shipping Pledge. And anyway, demand that your products not be shipped through the Arctic. And so speaking of improving things, I wanted to reiterate that even though there's 12 organizations making up the Climate Trace Coalition, there are over 100 other collaborators and researchers and data sources that are helping to strengthen the inventory. So this is a call to action for all of you. Go on the website, use the data, okay? Use the data for your personal life, use the data for your work. There's not a single person in here who couldn't benefit from looking at that data. And if you do have access to data, please share it and contribute so that it can be stronger and that we can improve the accuracy and the coverage for everyone else to use. That way, emitters and emissions will have nowhere to hide, and the lack of data will never again be a reason for the lack of action. Thank you.